You are listening to WTUZ Radio Podcast. Welcome to WTUZ Radio Podcast. I am your host, Rhonda. And today's topic, shout out to the sis, she wants to remain anonymous, brought me the information video that I will share in just a second here from another source. And I truly appreciate it. And it just kind of blends in on what we've been speaking on over the past couple years regarding how history has been rewritten. And specifically, if you want to get into the actual architectural structures, as well as the population, how we keep finding proof over and over again that the official historical narrative that they are telling us is not correct. That's on down from the architectural building structures on down to the population, and there clearly was some sort of reset. And at this point, I am believing there were multiple resets. Now, of course, I'm not the first to put this information out. I first heard of resets through a community called the Mud Floods. So shout out to them for their work. So this stuff just keeps lining up against the official narrative that they tell us. So this particular podcast, we're just going to add on regarding, this is going to be the fires and floods of the resets. Okay. So this first particular video is from a gentleman. This is on Rumble, so you already know what it is. He comes out with some hard-hitting information. So shout out to Cliff High. I'm just going to go midway through this video. But he starts out the beginning of the video speaking on his particular background, and he pretty much gives you insight on what qualifies him to give his opinion on how these particular events really jumped off. Okay. So I don't know if he's still doing this profession, but bottom line, he's kind of like a data scientist. That's what we call that role in the tech world, where he's able to take a group of data and kind of tell the true story of that data. Okay. And so with that said, that would definitely qualify him as he's doing research. And in his particular case, in this video, he's speaking on the fires. Okay. Now, I am going to have to give a disclaimer. Again, thank you, Cliff High, for this information. Now, he's going to go in on a particular group, BLM. And I just have to say, for the purpose of being not only respectful, but also legalities, I don't know what he's going to say for sure on that is true. It is speculation. I don't know that. Okay, just like I don't know, as he's going to speak on the Masons, if that is true. It's just speculation. All right, so I do want to get those disclaimers out there. But his logic in regards to how these fires are looking pretty suspicious, I find it quite interesting, and it appears to me that more than likely what he's speaking on, because the data doesn't lie, is accurate. Okay, so again, you can find this on Rumble, and this is called Lumpy Woo, Explorer Guide to the Sci-Fi World, Cliff High. So check it out. Okay, so let me see. And again, I'm just going to play 15 minutes into the vid. You're welcome to go over, and I encourage you to go over and subscribe to his channel, and you can get the first 15 minutes where he's going into his particular background. So we're going to open with this, and we're just going to go through a couple of other things to discuss these fires and floods. So here we go. So again, this is from Cliff High, and this is Lumpy Woo, Explorer's Guide to the Sci-Fi World.
Algorithmic trends across a broad surface. All right, I'll explain that in a second. But anyway, so my new map here is the whole globe. I'm just showing the United States because we're going to talk about the United States in a minute. And it had Antarctica and this kind of stuff, and I'll be using these to show various different aspects of the war. And so right now I'll tell you that our Lumpy Woo has allowed me to determine that there was a period of time, let's say it was 70 years, maybe it was slightly more than that, let's just say it bounded by 80 years or so in our past in North America, and this pertains to a lot of other countries, in which the bug attacked North America and burned down almost all of our major cities. And we don't have that in our history. We do, but we don't think about it. We don't even really, modern millennials and Zoomers or whatever the hell the other guys are called, they don't think about it. They don't ever really examine history. They're not taught to look at history. They're not taught to be curious about what's going on. My magnets are shifting. But major cities throughout the United States were burned in huge areas, 40 blocks, 50 blocks, 100 blocks, 1,000 buildings, 2,000 buildings, 5,000 buildings, 10,000 buildings, such that over this period of time, the bug burned down, the bug's minions burned down what we would think of as billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure. Vast quantities of infrastructure, just burned it to the ground. And it's easy to see if you go and look using these quick little queries that you can do. I'll show you one of them in a minute. But I'd just been doing this. I'd come across some interesting information that just made no sense. It was lumpy data, right? This should not occur. Certain things happen. So in the move from gas lights to electricity, we have a situation where there should be a predictable number of accidents in our society as we start to figure out as humans what electricity is all about and how we're going to use it, right? We're going to zap ourselves, we're going to set shit on fire, we're going to zap other people, all these different kinds of things as we move from one form of technology into another. This is predictable. It happened. There was a period of time as we electrified, as any area is electrified, there's a period of time in the beginning where you have all these accidents, then everything settles down as you get the hang of it. And usually these kind of things happen when you leave one technology and move into another on a mass adoption kind of a thing. Look at all of the people that, lost Bitcoin and that kind of thing as they moved into into cryptos for the very first time way back when, without any guidance, trying to figure it out on their own. And before that, look at all the people that were getting their phones ripped off and so on back in the 70s and 80s. And so as we bring in the new technologies, there's always this point of vulnerability. And these are not lumpy areas in data. These are predictable issues with our curves that show up as humans adopt anything, any kind of technology. And it's even predictable with the adoption of technology in a good way, going from early adopters to the mainstream users and then late adopters in the adoption of the technology, etc. Okay, so lumpy data, though, does show that we've had an attack and our social order had been under attack and large number of cities had been burned down. And I set out on a much more complex search, but I'll show you one of the searches I ended up with here in a minute. So I'm going to take this down, and you'll see what I'm talking about here as we get into it. And in the future, I'm going to use more of this to illustrate how our history has been removed from us, and that it's currently being undone behind us. The way what was the name of that movie? Anyway, some movie where they created the reality in front of you and undid it behind you. Anyway, so we've been attacked, okay? And so we've been attacked by the bug, and the bug has been eating on us for a bunch of years. Let me get rid of these magnets, hang on. Big map. It's a big world. Africa is giant. Okay, so we have the Great New York City Fire in 1835, and it repeats in 1845 in another area of New York, okay? We have Great Chicago Fire, 1871, Great Boston Fire, 1872, Great Seattle Fire, 1889, Great Baltimore Fire, 1906, Great San Francisco Fire, 1904 for Great Baltimore, 1906 for Great San Francisco. We have Denver in 1863, Houston in 1912, Portland in 1866. These are all great fires that did vast quantities of damage to whole regions, blocks and blocks and blocks of it.
And so I just also want to chime in and again, shout out to Cliff High. You can get this video on Rumble. And this particular title is Loopy Woo, Explorer's Guide to the Sci-Fi World. So shout out to you for this information. So I just want to point out, as he's going through these particular great fires, pay attention to the dates. And think of them in terms of any conflicts or wars, and in other historical events that they tell us was going on at the time as well. Okay, so I'll continue.
Okay, now Paris in 1900 had a great fire, but it is a single location and instance. It doesn't spread citywide. The reason that you bring it up here is because to note that we're looking in all of these areas here for areas where there's a lot of damage, big areas that are damaged. So in the Seattle fire, for instance, in 1889, 50 plus blocks, according to one source, or 100 plus blocks, according to another source, were totally destroyed and had to be rebuilt. Then there's all kinds of interesting lumpy data about the rebuilding of thousands of buildings in basically 2 years in Seattle, when we didn't have the capacity to produce the bricks, and they're all made out of bricks. Okay, we're a resource harvesting timberland, you know. We've got clays up here. If you know where to look and you can dig deep enough, you can get clays. But to get enough clay in a particular region to do a mass amount of brick building is like, right? Anyway, and so they rebuilt the whole city. In each and every one of these episodes, you will find that these fires are followed by an amazing recovery, a huge rapid rebuild in these large areas.
So let's stop again. And again, shout out to the Mudflood community, because they were the first ones that pointed this out, that when you look at, according to the historical narrative and timeline that they are giving us of these older buildings, number one, the buildings are so gigantic. And at the end of this particular video, I'll put together a collage of some of those buildings. And of course, it's just a snippet of them. The Mudflood community has done an excellent job of showing you these grandiose structures around the world. They're very well made buildings. They're built out of stone, out of brick. And I, once again, am in agreement with the Mudflood community, and I'm in agreement with Cliff High. Okay, so according to them, these buildings were built over a couple of years' time, and we're all scratching our heads like, how? When you're saying we were on horse and buggy, and not only that, let's say, for example, the Great Fire of New York, 1835, and then they had another one in 1835, and then another one in 1845. Then you had the Civil War, and the Civil War ended in 1865. It's just not making sense. It's not making sense that even when they're saying this rebuilding was going on in the late 1800s, with us just coming out of the midst of a civil war, and the scale of those structures, it just doesn't make sense. So he brings up a good point. Where were they getting the stone and material and the sand and the clay to make those bricks to build the buildings? It just absolutely, it logically doesn't make any sense, but we'll continue.
And that whole new things occurred. New companies came into existence that end up dominating the region. All of these kinds of things immediately in those 2 years following all of these fires in these local areas. Literally changed the whole economic as well as social and architectural landscape for these regions, okay? Paris, it did not. Some of these other cities, it did not. On my map, I was going to show you before I took it down, but that these great fires don't occur all of these are in the 1800s going up into the 1900s, right? And in this period of time, they pretty much stop in 1912. There's a few others after that, but not to the same level of damage and destruction as we see in all of these. Now, one could hypothesize that anything past 1912 date time, in a date wise here, would be too close to modern human memory to do this kind of thing, what we're looking at. So in other words, why did it stop in 1912? There's a lot of cities that didn't get burnt. A lot of these cities share certain characteristics that don't include these cities. And so we see there's areas like, okay, so let me show you the search, and you can go hunting for yourself, and you can rack up more of these here. So the criteria that you want to see is that when you get a result off of your search engine, and I'm using DuckDuckGo. So in your lumpy data, you want it to have multiple blocks, okay? You want to have it be a lot of blocks. These great fires were big. Seattle is like 50 to 100 blocks in that fire. The one in Manhattan here, I think that was 45 blocks coincidentally. Okay, so these are large areas that have burned. And so to do these searches, you go to the search engine and you say great, then leave a space here, fire of, all right? And so what you get is this. So you could put in here Boston. Great Boston Fire of, and when you tell it to hunt, it will naturally populate years in this space right here, more often than not. So you'll see that, oh look, there'd been a Great Boston Fire in 1872. In New York, you see Great New York Fire, you're going to get 1835 as well as the 1845, and then you'll get some other great fires that were single business fires. Great industrial damage, a lot of loss of life, but not damage to a great area of the city. So what I'm doing is looking for multiple blocks, great damage to areas of the city, as a result of all of this history hunting that I'm doing. And so I just came across this kind of anomaly. You don't see during this period of time in the 1800s, you don't see a lot of these great fires in other countries. I have yet to do Australia. I have yet to do any of the young countries that were building out at that point, because the in the United States, this was used, all of this here was used to destroy and obscure history. Such that we moderns won't know about what existed in these areas before those fires. And it was important to someone that we not know this. Now, if you go into these things, you'll also find that's why I have all these old encyclopedias. You will find a interesting cross connection. If I was one of those people that did infographics with all of the spider webs and stuff for people, I found a great number of people that are all interconnected in fires that are not in the city. So in other words, some people are involved in fires that are 1871 and then 1889, and then you see them resurface in 1904.
Okay. Ooh. So here comes the controversial part. I gotta put the little disclaimer in here. Y'all already know what it is. This is no disrespect to Mr. Cliff High. I don't know what he's about to say next is true, whatever the case may be. But just get ready. I don't know, but I thought it was awfully interesting that he said this group was resurfacing throughout the decades with these fires. Okay. All right, here we go.
And there are rumors in the ones in the 1880s here, the 1870s through the 1904 in the Northeast, that these were arranged by Freemasons, set by Freemasons. We also have that in Seattle. There was a big brouhaha about the Seattle fire being a set fire. Now, recently, here in the Northwest, back when the BLM guys were rioting and Portland was burning down and all of that, there was a lot of the BLM fuckers out setting fires, trying to set fires in the woods. So
now, of course, that's allegedly. I don't know that. I can't vouch for that. So it is what it is.
this is not an atypical occurrence that people would use such fires for political ends, right? And so it's well within the bounds here to understand that maybe indeed Freemason lodges were behind a lot of this, because we know that Freemason lodges were in charge of the destruction or the acquisition of artifacts for the Smithsonian.
Now, did y'all catch that? Let me just run that back.
Behind a lot of this, because we know that Freemason lodges were in charge of the destruction or the acquisition of artifacts for the Smithsonian. Boom.
Now, I do have to say, whenever we're talking about artifacts, and when you have these archaeological digs going on, number one, they fund a lot of them, meaning the Smithsonian. They fund a lot of those digs. And then number two, they're always on the scene when these archaeological finds happen, and they are buying out. Let's say it's an independent person. You bought some property and you're doing some type of remodeling, whatever the case may be. Let's say you're digging for a well and you run across some artifacts, and if word gets around, if you're not saying anything about it, you're going to be approached. Okay? And the Smithsonian is going to be involved. And in a lot of cases, they buy it from folk, because most people have a price. Okay? So they'll buy it from folks. Now, some claim that if they refuse to sell, and very little, because again, most folks take the money. But some claim if they didn't sell that it was confiscated as a natural archive. So there's always two organizations involved and in regards to keeping up with the artifacts, okay, and the archaeological digs. And that's going to be Smithsonian. And then the largest collection of artifacts is the Vatican. Okay. So folks are saying that the Vatican has an entire warehouse underneath its structure of various artifacts, anywhere from documents to paintings to statues. So you're going to continue to hear those two organizations involved in collecting artifacts. Now, one can say they're collecting those artifacts for historical purposes. And the other argument to that is, no, they're collecting them because they are the gatekeepers of history. Okay? So I find it awfully interesting. This is the first time I'm ever hearing that a Masonic organization was responsible for also collecting these artifacts and turning them over to the Smithsonian. Okay, so here we go.
There were too many bones of too many large people, too many anomalously large people in California for the Smithsonian to take them all in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, even into the 70s and 80s, I guess. And they'd done things. They'd burned a bunch. They paid people to haul them offshore and dump them. Then there was no real occurrences for a while, right? And then we get into the era of the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian had Freemasons hiring people in the World War I through the Depression to do more bone destruction offshore quietly. And we haven't seen any instances of it yet where they're taking that approach. So we do see historical scrubbing going on in near real time that we have people writing about. So we may not have had people photographing or doing videos of them throwing giant bones off the side of the ship, but we do have people's journals saying, hey, I got a real good job today. I was paid $1. I'm getting paid $1 a day, which was huge in the Depression, to throw heavy sacks over the sides of these ships off Catalina Island. And when I asked what was in them, they said, don't ask. But it felt like bones to me, but these were giant bones. Anyway, and so, just an entry in a journal. And everybody thinks, oh, the guy's a wackadoodle. But you see several thousands of these entries and that kind of thing, and you got some lumpy data you really got to look at, right? Anyway, so this was a big data lump that I thought to bring to your attention insofar as our history. And you can check this out yourself just by substituting in the name of the town and say Great Boston Fire of, and so on. And so all of these historical phrases, if you wanted to find out, you could do the same thing with battles, right? The great defeat of, and just look at how many of these things line up in lumpy data. And it's because somebody is out there massaging it. Anyway, so that's it. Weird shit going on. And we've got a bunch of other things happening, but I'll make a few more of these as we get past some projects I've got going.
Okay, so shout out to Cliff High. Again, this is on Rumble, and this is titled Lumpy Woo, Explorer's Guide to Sci-Fi World. All right, so we're just going to do this at a high level, fam. Whew, because he put a lot in there. So this is from historylecture.org, Great American Fires of the 19th Century. Let's go. So, during the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, the United States was afflicted with many urban conflagrations and wildfires as tactical firefighting and prevention practices were underdeveloped. Cities underwent transformation as areas formerly occupied by impoverished social classes were displaced by major fires and consequences relocated to different urban neighborhoods. Reconstructing in these 5 ravaged poverty wards attracted both new industries and the affluent. Cities were both architecturally and culturally revamped as they either relinquished or claimed their place as key industrial and artistic centers. Join historian John Horrigan as presents a lecture and slideshow that recounts a chronological of great American fires during the 19th century. Okay, so that's is what John Horrigan purpose of putting this together. Now, again, what stands out to me is these areas were impoverished. So if these were poor people, how did poor people wind up in these areas where they had these massive structures? Okay. That were either flooded or fires broke out and then stuff was rebuilt. So that within itself, it doesn't add up. Okay. Now, if they want to take the stance that, well, those particular areas, they were all just wooden shacks. That's why they burnt down. And when they rebuilt, that's when the conglomerate stone structures were built. Although, how was that done during an era of the Civil War when they're showing us pictures of these rebuilt structures, huge conglomerate structures that look like castles, but you see horse and buggies. So that doesn't add up within itself, because the population and the technology that they said existed doesn't match up to those structures that they claim that were rebuilt. Okay, but nonetheless, this is just his list of the fires. Okay, so you can see here's the list. New Hampshire, 1802. Detroit is very, very interesting, fam. And shout out to a couple folks that helped me that Detroit is a French word. The origins of it is French. So at the end of this particular podcast, I'm going to show some photos and you're going to see Detroit, the huge conglomerate buildings. Stone buildings look like castles to me that were built in Detroit. Okay. So Detroit's on the list for a fire in 1805. Now remember, we're talking fires. We're not even talking about the floods. Newburyport, Massachusetts, 1811. DC, 1812. And, that makes sense with the War of 1812. Okay, same with Buffalo, New York, 1813, Massachusetts, 1824. There go New York again with 1835. And New York, fam, it ain't no telling how many times New York has been built. Okay, because we do know New York went from the Dutch hands to the Brits' hands. So it's no telling how many times New York has been rebuilt. Pittsburgh, 1849. Nantucket, 1846. St. Louis is another one. St. Louis is another controversial one. Here they have 1849 for a fire in St. Louis. But we also have pictures of St. Louis where it was flooded. And we think about also St. Louis is one of the cities where they put on one of the world fairs with those huge, 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 huge conglomerate structures that they're trying to convince us that was built just for the purpose of that world fair. And then they tore it all down. Yeah, okay then. Okay. And not to mention the old school movie Meet Me in St. Louis with Judy Garland as a little girl and Mickey Rourke as a little boy. So you could tell how old that was. The final scene, they show the St. Louis World Fair. And then one of the little girls talking to her grandpa on how terrible it was. There was dead bodies everywhere in mud. So that would indicate that Hollywood was dropping hints about a mud flood that happened in St. Louis. And the little girl was asking, Grandpa, are they going to tear it down? And so her grandpa said they better not. So that right there was code in Hollywood that there was a great mud flood. All right. And of course, they tore down they tore down those structures that they were calling the World's Fair structure. San Fran, 1851. San Fran is another one where, shout out to the mud flood community again, as they show these huge conglomerate brick castles and structures. And it was a great fire in San Fran in 1851 that pretty much leveled out a bunch of structures. Okay. So San Fran is another place. We have Boston, 1861. Troy, New York, 1862. Atlanta, I mean, that should sound familiar to us in the almost at the end of the Civil War, 1864. And we know it's a story in Atlanta about the Yankees setting Atlanta on fire. Now, what they don't tell you about, okay, so anybody that's lived in Atlanta or that's from Atlanta know that no matter where you located in Georgia, folks up there talking about they're from Atlanta. And it's a really, really cute song by a local rapper in Atlanta called Not Atlanta. And she, we're Southerners, so she go, Not Atlanta. So she get to naming all these places that's not Atlanta. But anyhow, in the state of Georgia as well, we know that they're not telling the history is off, because if you look at the coastal part in Atlanta, and on some of those, I can't remember I think St. Simon and Jekyll, they are still a part of Georgia. But some of those older structures are huge castles. Okay? Huge castles that were either destroyed by fire or they tore them down. Okay? So the history, what they're telling us, those historical events, I'm not saying that they didn't happen, but it really appears reset-ish to me, with stuff being burned down to the ground. Okay? So Lawrence, M.A., 1864, Richmond, Virginia, 1865. Kaiser, burnout, well, child, y'all just gonna call it burnout. I wonder if that was its original name. Kaiser, Burnout, Texas, 1865. Portland, 1866. Port Huron, Michigan, 1871. Chicago, we know about the Great Fire in Chicago, 1871, and the explanation that they give, that is just straight up. I'm like, are you kidding me? You're trying to tell me that a cow kicked over a lantern and burnt the entire city down. But see, that's the story they give you if you thinking that it was just all wood structures. But yet, after the fire, what they're trying to convince us, that after these fires, they were able to go from those wood structures to rebuild in those cities to these huge conglomerate brick structures, and we see horse and carriages. And in the midst of seeing horse and carriages, we don't even see stone streets. We see dirt streets, particularly covered with mud. We see the structures, if you pay close attention, where they're not even at ground level. You see some of the structures submerged below the ground, okay? And again, at the end of this particular video, I put together some pictures, and some of them are repeats. Some of those pics are repeats when I talked about the flood. But you're going to see those muddy streets, and you're going to see some of those buildings that aren't at eye level. You're going to see some of those buildings that are still underground, right? So Peshtigo, Wisconsin, 1871. Boston, Mass, 1872. Oh, so y'all just gonna straight name this Thumbfire, Michigan, 1881. Okay, then. Martha's Vineyard, 1883. Charleston, a lot of stuff jumped off in Charleston in South Carolina. Lot of historical stuff in Charleston, South Carolina, regarding what they're saying are slave ports. A lot of stuff jumped off with the indigenous folks, i.e. the Indians. Okay, we now know through research that you had a population pouring into Charleston coming from Europe that were bankers called Huguenots, okay? And yes, they were melanated folk, but nonetheless, we'll stick to this topic. So it was an earthquake in Charleston in 1886? Really now? And shout out to the mud flood community, because they have captured pictures in the 1800s of structures, those Charleston, South Carolina structures. And they were brick and stone, huge conglomerates that look like castles to me. Okay. Seattle, Washington, 1889, and you heard the gentleman, Cliff, speak on a fire in Seattle as well. And then Roxbury, 1894. So just in this particular gentleman's work on historylecture.org, they're showing you in this image, just a drawing, but in Portsmouth, in New Hampshire, they had fires in 1802, 1806, 1813, 1835. Really now? Can we say resetting, destroying those old structures to make that area fit the rewriting of history? Okay. So Washington, I'm going to go ahead on and let them have that. regarding the fire, because we do know it was a war of 1812. So I'm going to go on and let y'all have that. I'm not even going to get on that one. Okay. All right. And so, again, they're showing New York burned 1835, but even in their drawing, those are brick structures. Those are brick structures. But let's continue. This is Nantucket. Let me try to blow it up for you all a tad bit. So this is another drawing of Nantucket in 1846. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that look bricks to me. Those structures look brick to me. Okay. Let's see. This is Portland, Maine. Okay, 1866. Okay. So they're showing some of the remnants. But this couldn't have been all wood, because as you can see, you still see brick structures still standing, parts of them anyway. Okay. Okay, so this is Chicago, 1871. Okay, and remember, Chicago also had a World's Fair that they're claiming supposedly and allegedly was just built for that World Fair. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you've already seen the pictures of the Chicago World Fair. I mean, when I tell you the structures were absolutely drop dead gorgeous. And some of those, and they claim they tore it down, but they decided to leave some of those structures, and they still stand today. So you minx to tell me that you show on historical record folks with horse and buggy, but yet they were able to rebuild after the fire these huge conglomerate structures for a World Fair and around town. And some of those structures still stand today. We're talking hundreds of years. They're still standing today. Okay. Oh, okay, then. Okay. All right. So this is Boston. Okay, so at least in this picture, they did try to make it a little bit more believable. Showing the structures going up in flame, but you take it for what it's worth on whether or not all of these structures were wood. Martha's Vineyard, 1883. Okay, I mean, if something's set on fire, they said wood structures burnt, right? Because that's the narrative they're giving in all of these fires. Well, why are there still trees in the area where stuff was burnt down? Didn't we just see this same narrative recently with the California fires? Oh, okay. So this is Roxbury, Massachusetts, 1894. After a fire broke out under the bleachers during a baseball game. Okay. Let me bring that in a little bit. Okay. Right. So you can definitely go to his lectures if you want to get his view on the fires and the rebuilding. And he was just more speaking about from an industry standpoint. It was something. None of these sources are here anymore. I've just wanted to show you based on what the gentleman Cliff was talking about even industries. Some of the fires were industries. So here he's saying that a fire in Boston gutted the printing presses at Boston Herald newspaper in 1855 and 1864. Again, more fires in Boston. Now he's saying, and it's not him saying, and this is what history is saying, because of riots. Okay, 1852, 1854. Okay, another fire in Marshfield, Massachusetts from, it was in 1853, and this was a Boston piano factory. Okay, so that's yet another industry. Okay, so this one in Boston broke out in a theater, 1852. It was rebuilt twice and burnt down in 1879 and again in 1893. Well, honey, that theater got some bad luck. Right. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can kind of get the gist of what was going on. Again, he's given two accounts in Canada and fires that were that happened as well. Okay, this one I found interesting. Recorded on July 9th, 2007 at Watertown, Massachusetts, John reads from David Ludlum's Vermont weather book about a strange darkness that enveloped the Vermont daylight from November 9th through the 11th, the year of 1819. Okay, so I just found that interesting. So, but of course, the source is no longer here where I can go in specifically what was this strange darkness, what was going on from a weather perspective that caused fires. Okay. So we talked about that Boston one. And so this one is saying an arsonist in Boston in the late 17th century, which that's about the only arsonist one that I've seen. And you note that was in the 17th century. Okay. And then I really wish I could have got to this because he also went over some great recorded fires in Rome. Okay. All right. So again, this is from historylecture.org and it's from the work of John Horrigan. You can go on YouTube if you want to get his take on what shook down regarding the fires. It's called The Great American Fires of the 19th Century. My purpose was to just give you the list of the fires and the years associated with them. Okay. All right. So just real quick, I want to jump to New Orleans. So this is from FrenchQuarter.com. French Quarter fire and floods. Of all the forces that conspire to destroy a city, time, storm, neglect, need, fire does the most harm. Without Prometheus, we might have more of our colonial cities to preserve and savor. Two great fires in the late 18th century, New Orleans left the inhabitants with few years to reestablish their institutions before the onset of the American domination in 1803. Although several fine houses date to the last colonial decades, they and the French Quarter, including the Cabildo and Presbytery, are conspicuously post-fire. Look at the vibrant the festive quarter with millions of visitors annually. It is hard to imagine the devastation of Holy Saturday in 1788. Smoking ruins stretched from Chartres to Dauphine Street, from Conti to St. Philip. The fire began on Good Friday morning in the home of Spanish treasurer Don Vincent Nunez at Toulouse and Chartres. So forgive me, New Orleans natives. Y'all know that's French, so I know y'all know how to pronounce that. It was a blustery March day with the wind blowing out of the southeast, probably in a cool front. Within hours, over 800 homes and public buildings were reduced to ashes, including the church, the town hall, and the rectory on the Plaza de Armas. A saddened governor reported to Spanish authorities of the abject misery, crying, and the sobbing of the people. Now remember, this is 1788. The faces of the families, he wrote, told the ruin of a city which in less than 5 hours has been transformed into an arid and horrible wilderness, the work of 70 years since its foundation. The second great fire. Rebuilding had scarcely begun when in 1794, a second fire and 2 hurricanes swept the city. The fire of December 8th that year burned 212 buildings, fewer but more valuable. Okay, so when they're saying more valuable, I'm only in my mind thinking that there must have been some really great structures. Now, me personally, I don't think of them as wood structures, but let's continue. When both storms and both fires were all done, nearly all public buildings, homes, and businesses, except those fronting the river, had been consumed or badly damaged. Through it all, the Ursuline nuns and their convent on Chartres Street had prayed to Notre Dame de Bon Secours, Our Lady of Prompt Succor, patron of Rouen, their hometown. As the fire had neared the convent on that Good Friday, the wind changed suddenly. As Providence would no doubt have it, the front arrived from the north just in time. The convent survived and is still here with us today. Okay, so y'all in New Orleans, there you have it. So in 1794, that fire broke out, but that convent still stands. The results were fundamental to the quarter. Baked tiles and quarry slate replaced the roofs of axe-hewn cypress shingles. Buildings set at the sidewalk or banquette were all brick with common firewalls. Okay, so y'all doing brick in 1794. Okay. The wide and shallow hipped roof, galleried townhouse, perfected in the French period, gave way to vertical, long and narrow Spanish-style townhomes, many with overhangs, ironwork, and trestles of mezzanines. Oh, okay, so I'm not going to read all of that. So they're given how it was rebuilt. It's interesting. Protestants gain a foothold. And this is a reoccurring theme that we see also when we talk about the either rebuilding of these towns, when we talk about the settlements, when we talk about the colonies, we see these different religious organizations involved, what they call missionary work. And in this case, they're saying the Protestants. Okay. But I find it interesting that they're saying that they rebuilt these structures from that fire to the to some Spanish style that we see today. Okay. All right. So, all right. Okay. Okay, so it's saying every quarter square scarred by the elements since the two great fires, Providence has not seen fit to visit the quarter with any more all points conflagration up to that moment, but hardly a square in the quarter has not had its smaller fires. And hurricanes keep coming, as they keep coming today in New Orleans. A great storm of 1812, swept away a brand new year-old French market building. Another in 1915 damaged the steeple of St. Louis Cathedral. The popular Orleans Theater and Orleans Ballroom burned in 1816. Rebuilt, and then it burnt again in 1866. Child, there you got it. So, today the French Quarter fire code is stringent. Motorized Mardi Gras parades are forbidden. Any quarter fire signals an instant citywide fire alarm. The intent is to prevent fires from spreading. Still, the most important fires of the 20th century occurred at individual structures. Okay, social historians consider the burning of Old French Opera House on Bourbon in 1919 the final nail in the coffin of the old Creole culture in the quarter. Okay, so there you have it. That's just the French Quarter. Fire and floods in New Orleans. Okay, so let's just jump over to old Wikipedia for their list of town and city fires. Of course, so now, of course, this list isn't the end all be all, but just to give you an idea of these fires that's been going on for quite a few times. So this is a major urban conflagration. Before the 20th century, fires were a major hazard to urban areas and the cause of massive amounts of damage to cities. For notable fires that involved a single structure, we don't want to see that. Wildflowers, fires, whatever. Transportation fires, whatever. Okay. All right. So, it's just going through the different ones. So they're going all the way back to the Temple of Jerusalem, Carthage. Okay, and they were saying burnt down over 17 days by the Romans at the end of the Punic Wars. Great Fire of Rome. So as you can see, we can go through, and this is all over the world, these different fires. Now, some of these fires are lining up also with wars. Okay. Now, some of these, like China, shout out to the mud flood community because they have shown structures of China. China did not look like the old structures that they are telling us today are from China, are not the structures that the mud flood community show us. What the mud flood community are showing us are structures that look Romanist and Greek. Okay? So I'm pointing out, here again, you have fires in China, a couple times in China. But the point being, what they're calling ancient structures in China, and I know anyone that is listening to this, you already have a picture in your mind what they're calling ancient China, because it's unique architecture that in your mind makes you think of Asia. But the mud flood community shows us older structures that had the style of Roman and Greek, and it looked like any European city. All right. So as you can see, we can keep going through this all these great fires all over the world: Italy, Germany, etc., Britain, Amsterdam. All right. So now that was just all the way up to the 1400s. You get into the 16th century, you see Moscow had 2 fires. Edinburgh had a fire. Okay. You get to the 17th century, you can see all over the world again. Scotland, Norway, right? So all over Europe, but they do have it here in the 1600s, Jamestown, Virginia, in the Bacon Rebellion. So that makes sense. Okay. But then you notice back to Europe with Germany and all that jazz. Okay, so then you get to the 18th century, okay, with the 1700 dates. And you can see these are in Europe. We do have Boston on here, though. Okay. All right. So you go through this list. I guess that's Montreal. That's Canada. All right. That was 1734. Okay. Boston on the little list again. Okay. And remember, they were some of the first colonies. All right. New York on the little list. 1776. Okay. We talked about New Orleans. That's that 1788 one. Okay. So again, you can see all of these different fires. So when we get to the 18th century, now you're going to start to notice the Americas being on fire. Okay. So the Detroits, the New Yorks again, New Hampshire, Puerto Rico, and shout out to the mud flood community as well, because they provided pictures of Puerto Rico looking awfully European with Greco-Roman structures. Oh, but it caught on fire in the 1820s. Oh, okay then. Remember when I told y'all about Georgia on those coastlines? They had grandiose structures that looked like castles. And it was a Great Savannah Fire in 1820 that burned 500 structures. That's just in Savannah alone, fam. Okay. All right. So you see North Carolina, Fayetteville. We talked about Charleston. Now, remember I told y'all Charleston had 1,000 buildings. And those Charleston structures were stone They were Greco-Romanist structures. Shout out to the mud flood community. All right. So as you can see, you're going through most of the burning going on, or the fires going on in the 1800s, were the Americas. Okay. All right. Okay. So we kind of went through that. I'm not going to go on anymore with that. So that's that. So I also kind of wanted to go over, just so you can see that I found this interesting when I was just looking for a list of the floods, that there's this whole flood myth, and which this makes sense. I mean, this should be nothing new to a lot of us, but it did get me thinking, because I'm thinking it and from the standpoint that these floods that were going on, or the Great Flood, we can equate that to a great reset. Okay? So it's the same tactic, even if we use these myths. So the myths coming up out of the Bible, coming up out of the Sumerian text, etc., those were forms of resets. Okay? So, a flood myth or deluge myth is a myth in which a great flood, usually sent by a deity or deities, destroys civilizations, often in an act of divine retribution. Parallels are often drawn between the flood waters of these myths and the primeval waters, which appears in certain creation myths, as the flood waters are described as a measure for the cleansing of humanity in preparation for rebirth, i.e., reset. Most flood myths also contain a culture hero who represents the human craving for life. The flood myth motif occurs in many cultures, as seen in the Mesopotamian flood stories, the Genesis flood narrative, so Noah and them. So the Mesopotamia, that's Enki and Leo and them. Hinduism, Chinese mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Irish mythology, Polynesian mythology, and the Maya people in Mesoamerica. Okay? So, my point being that all of these ancient texts from these different cultures around the world talk about these great floods, which, i.e., are resets. And we still see this throughout history of floods and the rebuilding of society. Okay? So I'm saying all that to say that it's basically the same script. All right? So we're just going to jump over real quick to the list of floods around the world. And they're saying a Mississippi flood happened in 1543, California flood of 1605. And then we can just go on and on. The Mississippi River floods several times, fam. Several times. Okay. Now, of course, this list isn't the end all to be all list. But this gives you a pretty good idea. All right. And then you're also going to see in here where they talked about the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1844, the largest flood ever recorded on the Mississippi River, excuse me, in the upper Mississippi River in terms of discharge. The flood was particularly devastating since the region had few, if any, levees at the time. Among those hit were Wyandotte, and the flood is also the highest recorded for the Mississippi River at St. Louis. So this reminds me of what that baby was talking about in the movie Meet Me at St. Louis when they were at the World Flood Fair. My bad, a Freudian slip. At the World Fair, and she talked about it was horrible. It was horrible, Grandpa, all of the dead bodies, all of the mud. Okay? So it appears to me that some type of flood happened. We're calling mud flood. That's why it's mud, called mud flood. And the repopulation, the repopulation of people were the cleanup crew to dig out that mud, and some of those structures were left standing until they systematically started even tearing those down through either floods. They say fires, but I don't care what you say. You cannot burn stone to the ground. Not with fire. You got to use something else. You sure can't use no fire. Okay? So, another Mississippi flood, 1851. So you're getting the gist of what's going on here. All of these floods. Okay? All right, and they go into the 1900s, but we don't have to go that far. So just to give you an idea. Now, just to refresh folk memory, when we talk about a population, when I talk about the reset population, in the drop that I did recently on the miseducation of the American Indians, the reset population, the worldwide reset population, it just so happens that between all of these fires and these floods, what was also going on? You mean to tell me these orphan trains, these orphanages, between 1854 and 1929, there was an orphan train movement? Really now? Huh? So you had a group of children coming from Europe into the U.S. from the time periods of 1854. Now you got to take into account Civil War jumping off, because that ended in 1865. So you got the Civil War jumping off. You got major fires and floods jumping off. And in between that, you have orphan trains jumping off from Europe. You have orphanages being established. And those orphanages were in those castle-like looking buildings. And then you also had insane asylums that were in castle-like looking buildings, and hospitals and prisons and castle-like looking buildings. And not only did we find out that there were Caucasian white orphans, we also found the same with Black, aka melanated folks as well, melanated orphan children. Can we say reset population. And the main purpose of these children were, because they said, they didn't have their parents weren't around and they were so poor. But we find out that these children were being educated and trained with the trade, and then they were shipped out across the United States to be adopted by a family. But they were only able to do that until they were educated and they were trained. So why would they have to educate them and train them before they got adopted? Can we say laborers? Can we say the inheritors of literally what they rebranded as the New World? Can we say that that population would carry forward what we call mainstream history today? Can we say a switching of identities? Okay. Now remember, we just went through fires around the world. Last week, we talked about the orphanages around the world. No one was untouched from these orphanages. All of this seems like a planned worldwide reset to me. Okay. So again, I just wanted to bring this to your attention, kind of putting into play what the orphan trains were about. That was the reset population, and lining up with the many fires and the many floods that were taking place throughout the 18th century. Okay. But it appears this has been happening, what they're willing to document, since the 1600s. Okay. So I hope you all got some value out of this. Again, shout out to the mud flood community for your hard work with digging through all of those photos showing around the world that the ancient structures looked all the same. So meaning it appears that there were already a worldwide system in place. Okay. All right. So hope you all got some value out of this. Shout out to the mud flood community. Shout out to this particular gentleman, Cliff High, on his take on Explore, and this is called Lumpy Woo, Explorer's Guide to the Sci-Fi World. I'll leave a link in the description for his video on Rumble. I think he used solid logic on these particular fires. So I want to thank you all, and shout out to the sis. She know who she is, who wants to remain anonymous, for sending me this information on Lumpy Woo. And so thank you, family, for listening. I will, at the end of this video, I'll put in some pictures kind of giving you snapshots of these structures that were either flooded, or you can tell were the remains of a flood that happened, and fires. I threw in a couple from around the world, but they are mostly concentrated in the United States, or what we're calling the United States today. So I wish everyone well on this Monday. And if you are not subscribed to us, I highly encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this video. This is Rhonda from WTUZ Radio Podcast. Peace and love, family.